Hello and good afternoon and most welcome to 875. We are presently recording out here in one of the suburbs of Gothenburg called Högsbo. High Village, one could call it. It's a suburban area from the early 60s and now it's rejuvenating. Gentrification was a couple of decades ago and now it's young once more. One see children playing around, and this is a natural development. Something that might not be that natural is the metaphysics of presence, a term made by Jacques Derrida with inspiration from Martin Heidegger, and something that is of course forbiddingly hard to speak about, but I do take the liberty still because we have talked so very much both about Martin Heidegger and Jacques Derrida. So I think there is a well-established knowledge that will hinder us from making preemptive definitions or even fall into the trap to say that the metaphysics of presence is an ideology or a movement or an idea even. It's neither. It defies definition, but I think because of this height of knowledge, like the height village, the village on the height we are presently, this height is going to assist us, because most of the knowledge we have, we don't even consciously pinpoint them. There are underneath, but they are a definite necessity to understanding. And of course I've been realizing that for a long time, but that became much clearer with Rodolphe Gasquet, where he shows that without this foundational knowledge you cannot go to having a deeper understanding of deconstruction, and even to do it yourself. That's a step that can only be taken with a foundation. And part of that reason is that it's a change of the whole person, not only the intellect, but the body goes in. And we need to have things well established, repeated, and known almost by instantaneous action. Well, going back to metaphysics of presence, or my favorite expression is logocentrism. And that holds that Western philosophy has a somewhat paradoxical presupposition of a stable, self-same, simple present, or a being at the heart and beginning of thought. And these presupposed entities occurs as fundamentals to principles or to the center, and have always, this is important, always, and I usually add always, already designated an invariable presence. For instance, eidos, arche, telos, energia or energia, ousia. Ousia, that can be in the definition of essence or existence, substance, actually, oddly enough, even subject. And then we have aletheia or aletheia, transcendentality, consciousness, God, man. And these, or this I should say, express logocentrism's longing for presence at the center of thought. Moreover, this logocentrism generates a hierarchized hierarchized system of opposites. So once the system is, so to speak, put in place, which happens automatically and directly without any waiting, this is not a development, it happens instantaneous. But once that happens, this also generates immediately a hierarchized system of opposites. And hierarchized, which I can't hardly pronounce, means that we usually, not always, but usually have two polarities. One is preferred, the other one is lesser, demonized even. And the superior term in these opposites serves to establish their status and thus make the others inferior. And we have many examples: being and nothingness, or being or emptiness, presence and absence, immediacy and distance, identity versus difference, speech versus writing. The superior terms, being, presence, immediacy, identity, speech, are traditionally favored over the counterparts. And that is a very important trait, and the trait that I've been focusing mostly when it comes to Rodolphe Gasquet is that the one of identity. Identity is very hard to grasp because it is not a proposition, it's not a hypothesis, it cannot really be verbalized. But what helped me is the idea of looking into the mirror and thinking that one who looks into the mirror is more perfect, that's one thing. It's more original, that's another thing. But it's also, and here's the tricky part, identical to itself. It's never different. And to make it even clearer, think of this: when I reflect over this identity, there is a certain amount of time for my thinking to take presence. And in that certain amount, there is a little lag going on. So it's never exactly identical. First, you have the presence, and then you reflect upon it. And the reflection is a bit later. So it seems that self-identity also have a lag, because perfection has a lag. When you look into the mirror, the reflection coming back is distorted. So you think the first thing is more original. But the first thing is not the first thing you see. It's something that goes back in time, and it's not completely present. That is almost in a nutshell what difference is. Something that always differs to itself. It's not the same thing. An identity, for me to be thinking about myself and my development, was actually maybe the hardest nut to crack, to sort of tie up. It was a very tough nut. Self-identity is so close to our thinking, and it's also that we are not really aware that there is a time lag. And one helpful thing here was the slow movement we are doing. Once we do the slow movement, it is easier to get a grip that the thinking of reflection, the idea of identity comes a little later. But if you are in the movement, self-identity is going to be very tough to get around or understand, or deepening understanding. And this is one of those things that are so interesting. You need to slow down thinking. This cannot be understood with a speeded up thinking. The speeded up thinking is produced by logocentrism. Logocentrism is speedy thinking because it always jumps corner, it cuts corner, it's being too quick, and therefore you don't see that reflection is a bit late. Once you reflect, there is a perfection, there is a self-identity, it's already too late because it's almost, or I would say every time, it is actually plagued by difference. So if you see that self-identity is the ideal, the perfection, you will understand that there is a disease haunting self-reflection, and it's this time lag. And this is similar, not the same thing, as perfection has an enemy, and that is imperfection. The mirror sort of bends the light a little different. All because of the tane at the very back of the mirror, because that distorts. And Derrida, as you hear, he used a lot of different terms to describe, or maybe it's a better word to say, hint to the centering or the centrism of Western philosophical tradition. And of course this is nothing that ever been pointed out until Heidegger. It's not something people pondered about or even hinted to. So this is a new thing. And I, for myself, I wouldn't say there is a clear connection between what happened in the 1920s, but I would say, oddly enough, it seemed to be happening in the same 1 or 2 decades. I think that was a turning point in our history. Other words that are quite interesting that Derrida uses are phallogocentrism. Phallogocentrism. I think that's connected to the phallus. And just give me a second, could you put a pause there? Phallogocentrism points to the patriarchal system, where the man usually has been the one that puts himself into the center, and his voice and his opinions. And it's a point of privilege. And this privilege is maybe one of the most interesting. This is how I stepped into Derrida, because I always thought before I read Derrida that polarities were equal in some way. Well, I didn't think it, but I assumed it. I think that's more correct. But once I started to understand one thing is not as good as the other thing, and actually it had been in my head earlier on, but I wasn't able to pinpoint it, to describe it for myself. But there's a sense that non-existence is not so good. It is, for instance, not so good not to exist. The emptiness seemed to be something degraded existence. And this we actually have from Parmenides, who abhorred everything that was empty. Horror vacui. And emptiness also scared me. It seemed to be a counterpart that should be evicted from reality. And full presence and existence was the better thing. But until I read Derrida, I actually didn't have any conscious idea. I made this sort of hierarchy in my mind, even in my body. So it goes to show we need this great man, we need great literature, also need great philosophy. It is important, otherwise we get stranded in things that was, oddly enough, well established long before one was born. And how would it be possible to be sort of living in reality and suddenly realize these things. And I would say that's absolutely impossible. Knowledge is not something to be fooled with. We need knowledge, and this knowledge, I would say, is especially important. Most of his ideas that Derrida has when it comes to the metaphysics of presence is coming from Heidegger. So one could say that Heidegger sort of paved the way for Derrida. And Heidegger means that Western thinking tradition mostly privileged what is. This is called estein in Greek. This existence seemed to have a privileged role all through, sometimes mentioned and sometimes always assumed instead. And if something is not mentioned and only assumed, we become dependent on it because we don't have a choice anymore. It is in the very core of existence. And these unassumed things seem to have great importance. Instead of just looking at what appears, Heidegger wants us to take a good look into how it appears. In what way does it appear? And those things seem to be equivalent in the beginning when one reads Heidegger, or before one started to really sort of train these things. But they are not the same thing, although they seem that in the beginning. And this is also similar to the mirror image, and it's helpful to think that thing that looks in could be said often to be what is, and what's coming back is the process, because the mirror does something. It's an action. It takes time. It takes a little bit of movement as well. So it's nothing still. And this moving thing could be the first way of actually distinguishing something interesting lies underneath. Let's look deeper into it. Because the big problem is not that we decided what it is, rather that we never thought about it. And this is why Heidegger calls this the forgetfulness. Once it was settled, however it was settled, it was without a doubt forgotten. The process of coming to the conclusion or decide that existence is much more important than how it exists. And once we're starting to go so far, we're starting almost to realize immediately that for something to exist, there must be something where it can exist. Existence cannot stem from nowhere. It needs a room to exist. And here comes emptiness knocking on the door. It seems that emptiness doesn't have such an insignificant and fearful role to play. Maybe emptiness is not our arch enemy, that all of Western thinking and all of Western society been thinking that emptiness is really the most horrible thing that can happen to anyone. Actually, emptiness is the prerequisite for existence. And according to Heidegger, the mistake, if you call it that, what we've been doing is by throwing out emptiness, we also threw existence out of the window. You throw the baby out with the bathwater, and this is a parasitic tendency, or as I like to call it, an autoimmune disease. Because what does an autoimmune disease do? Well, you have a defense against exterior attacks in the form of bacteria, amoeba, viruses. But if you don't get attacked, the system itself will attack itself. Allergy, asthma, arthritis, loads of different diseases. And this thinking process of sticking too much to existence means that you are getting rid of what you really need, the emptiness, because emptiness gives opportunities. It's a bit similar to have a working autoimmune system, because it needs the bad things, the things that we also parted reality into good things and to bad things. And here it starts to keep only the good stuff that we already ourselves before a priori decided it's bad. We stick to that, and then we got not only sticking to something, we get stuck. And there is a certain stuckedness in the Western tradition, and this is the metaphysics of presence. That's one way that it can, so to speak, reveal itself or show itself. And mind you, it's so easy, if you don't consider these things, to fall into the trap. I was really engaged myself in something that the author I read was a philosopher of sort, but he constantly repeated, "What is?" And that was supposed to be self-evident. Why don't people care about what is? They should only care about what is. And that what is was supposed to be the same for everyone. But not a single mentioning why, or rather how, what is can appear. How does that happen? Well, it happens with emptiness, because emptiness is potentiality. Emptiness is also spaciousness, and emptiness is also, oddly enough, control. Because if you don't have control over the medium where existence takes place, where is your control? It's a little bit like having a car but you don't have any tires. They are codependent, and we get stuck believing that one part is bad or a priori bad, and we make a preemptive attack and we kick it in the butt. But what we are kicking at is ourselves, no one else, because we lose existence in the same movement. The thing we're striving for, that's exactly the thing we're losing. And I remember now, it's a lot of things that come clear to memory thanks to the Tane of the Mirror. But in the late 90s, it's all of a sudden just became clear for me, why is modern society so soulless? Why do everybody think they don't have an eternal existence? Why is there nothing higher? And why don't we have a free will anymore? Well, it's no wonder, because we are constantly attacking the thing that gives us permanent existence, free will, or a higher being, and loads more things. That's just the top of the iceberg. The tip of the iceberg is loads more going on. We've been attacking literature. We've been casting out intellectuality, something that Heidegger mentions, or Spengler already in the 20s, that intellectualism is gone. Why? Because it's been persecuted. We ourselves have shoved it away, and we are the only one who can do that. Not even oppression can take away intelligence. That power is only in our hands. And I thought that's so brilliant, and I've forgotten about that, and now it feels like a good time to remember those good things once more. It's not so much that Derrida, or some people even call Heidegger this postmodern. They are actually in a way very traditional, because they're defending the very core of Western thinking against its inner enemy. Yes, I'm sorry, I'm using warlike metaphors, and that's an exaggeration, it's an hyperbole, but it's intended today. This is going to be a crusade, just this lecture, because we know it's not that exaggerated, but sometimes it could be good to spice the whole thing up, to give a movement, and then you can go back to the middle way, because of course that is what Derrida wants, to have something in between. Let's get back to this fantastic thing, presence. It is of course the privileged thing. It is my voice being here in this now and nowhere else, in this very thin hymen of a line that is the now, which discards everything to do with the future and tells us that the absence of the past is something stale, rotten, no longer functioning. This is the small area which you can hardly stand on. No wonder we are unbalanced today, because we need full time to be balanced, to be calm, to be present. Instead, we turn into the worship of the now, the thinnest of lines. And it's of course also in this presence the superficial objects come to appear, because there is no time to get into the objects. It's no time to be in the world or together with the world. The world is just flashes, and they're no longer for me. And I get so hasted in my thinking. There is no time to put any awareness to anything particular or specific. And that was also a thing I thought about so many years ago. Why is there such a lack of awareness? I remember one class I took in logic, where the professor himself couldn't keep up with his own thinking line. He constantly had to remind himself where he was going, looking at the blackboard or into his notes. That didn't seem to be a sure line somewhere. And this has been observed by many authors and later also proven by neurology and science of cognition, that the modern intellect is cut off. It begins in the next second, always with a new thing, and never anything consistently. And of course this is a great problem, but he never got any explanation until I read this, starting to realize, well, might be that we are doing that thing to ourselves. The very luster of presence makes that we never become present, really, because if we don't invite absence in the form of past and future, of course this line becomes very thin. And especially also when we use the borders, the limitations, the partitioning as a definition for what is now. This is how we define now in Western society, by what it is not. And what it is not is past and future. Dependency once more. And that actually, oddly enough, gives the presence the disease of absence. You once more have this parasitic tendency that the now you're looking for becomes directly tainted, because this is how you sort of cut it out of reality. You cut out a part to have an existing part. And this is exactly more or less what I read in a condensed format when I understood that the thing I did to have existence, the way of creating existence for me and for many others, that was to define it negatively with what it was not. And there is a big problem underneath that sort of doings, that movement, because it undermines the thing you want. And now you can see it from another perspective, from time, to wanting to be in the moment. And if you define the past and the present, or the future I mean, to be bad things, you will be rushed immediately. There will be no temporal area for you to live. In the same way, if you define existence as being not negative space, that is emptiness, you got a problem directly, because you shrink. And I can feel the shrinkage right here and now. When I forget and get too much into the camera, I need to take in the background, the surroundings, the empty space. And even I as a self become to exist more clearly. I can feel a larger presence. So it goes both for time and space. Take in the oppositions. Let them be. The difference will not disappear. I think that could be the fear, that if I take in space around me, I would disappear into that space. It's just the opposite. You will exist even more, because you can have both. And this is what the mirror shows. You can have absolute clear difference. At the same time, it is also similar to 100%. A thing can be 100% different and be 100% the same. And I think the mirror in some way make us choose, and that choice is not necessary. And this is of course appealing to me. I am the sort of person who like to have the cookie and eat it. Isn't it great? This actually goes for all of reality. You can have them both. Actually, both time and space invites you to do that very thing. You can stop with this almost an anorectic behavior of saying, I can only have only space. You're starting to be like a person treating a loaf of bread, and you say, maybe there's some mildew on the end of the loaf. You take a little away, and then you think, well, that part that was connected to the mildew, I should take away that as well, because that's not longer suited for eating. And then you take a larger part off, and then you take a larger part off. Everything you start thinking is infected by the mildew. You can change the mildew into emptiness. And my fixation on wanting to define in myself here makes me doing the borders slimmer and slimmer and slimmer. It's like this. And in the end you stand like this. You can hardly breathe. And this is oddly enough the posture of Western man today. Modern Western man seem to have both very little time, in the sense that they feel rushed in their heads, rushed in their thoughts, and rushed in what they are doing, but also little space. And that little space is caused by a preemptive want for existence, when it's better just to relax and let existence and emptiness come to you, because there's nothing bad in emptiness. And I won't mention it this lecture, but I would even recommend to do deconstruction as a healing method. I'm getting more and more interested in an American-Italian author called Robert Magliola. I read him 20-25 years ago, but I didn't really understand it at that point. The mirror helped. But he means that deconstruction is healing both for soul, mental sphere, and body. Because as you see, this delineation, or out of fear of emptiness, or out of fear of past or future, whatever that could be, that is what makes us limited. This is what makes us limited incorporated. That's partly actually some of the stories in that book. Although it's a criticism on the surface to John Searle and the analytic tradition, it is actually much more than that. It's pointing to oneself, that the limitation can come and cause these things that are so unnecessary. And the constructing things, I was thinking the other day, do I need to exist all the time? Well, I don't. Just by thinking that relaxes the position a great lot, because existence is not something you have to demand. It's still there. It's always there. It's not something you can lose. And I think that's an incredibly happy message coming from these grand figures in philosophy, and also helped by different other authors to give us the way where we can have a fuller presence, and also, which I will return to later on, a grander knowledge where everything can become knowledge once you understand that no knowledge is not a problem. But that's another lecture. I say thank you very much. Becoming chilly, let's move about. Cheers.
Thank you.